And good evening, good day, ladies and gents. I don't think this is going to be a particularly long stream. Just wanted to do a little talk about the Battle of the Atlantic, and in particular, do a bit of a review of one of my favourite British war films, The Cruel Sea from 1953. Now, before we start, I'm going to play the trailer from The Cruel Sea. And YouTube, please note, this is for fair use review purposes. So anyway, here we go.
This is a story of the Battle of the Atlantic. A story of an ocean, 2 ships, and a handful of men. The men are the heroes. The heroines are the ships. The only villain is the sea. The cruel sea. But man has made more cruel.
What's it look like now, number one? It's the firmest contact we've ever had.
There are some men in the water just about there.
Well, there's the U-boat just underneath them.
Attacking, stand by. Target moving quickly right, sir.
Range 200. Range 100.
Instant check off, sir.
Fire one.
It's getting to be a different kind of war, number one. The people in it have got different, too.
In what way do you mean that?
In the beginning, there was time for all sorts of things. Understanding people. Making allowances for them. Now the war doesn't seem to be a matter of feelings anymore. Now it's just a matter of killing the enemy.
We'll be off again in no time at all. Julie, am I wrong? Is it better to have something to lose?
It's better still to have something to live for.
We always seem to be getting these diversion jobs nowadays, don't we, sir? Sort of compliment, I suppose.
Pretty cold one. Cold night, too.
Coco's just coming up, sir.
Yeoman, sir, call up Vipers on RT, plain language. Say torpedo 15 miles astern. Aye,
Okay, guys, that was the trailer for The Cruel Sea from 1953, which is based on a best-selling novel. And I'll talk about that a bit more in a bit. But first of all, for modern guys especially, just an outline of the Battle of the Atlantic. Now, obviously, Britain is an island nation. And she cannot feed herself and hasn't been able to for a very long time, and probably never will be able to either. The amount of land in the UK as an island is limited. So, and also she's a trading nation. So obviously she depends on selling stuff that she makes and importing stuff that she needs. And for that reason, needs a powerful navy. And in 1939, 1945, Britain had a large empire around the world, including the self-governing dominions of Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, and therefore had to have a powerful navy to protect all those places, in addition to India and various African colonies and places in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific, and even in the Caribbean and so on. So in 1939, Britain, the one armed force of the British that was still pretty powerful and just about the largest in the world still, even compared to the Americans in 1939, was the Royal Navy. But it was only just about big enough. It was a lot more powerful than the German Navy, and because the Germans decided to invade Norway in early 1940, between the Norwegians and the Royal Navy, somewhere between a quarter and a third of the German surface fleet was destroyed in the Norwegian campaign. So the idea that the Germans in 1940 had any chance whatever of invading the UK, whether or not they won the Battle of Britain in the air, is a nonsense. They just couldn't have done. Even if somehow or other they could have sneaked that first wave of troops ashore, the Royal Navy would simply have steamed south and have cut off all their supplies of ammunition, food, and everything else that an army needs to survive. So Germany knew in 1940 they had absolutely no chance whatever of invading UK, and the whole sea lion thing is a nonsense. Utter nonsense. It just could not have happened. Now, moving on to the Battle of the Atlantic. Britain needed to export stuff around the world, and particularly in World War II, needed to import food and also munitions and fuel and all sorts of other stuff. And most of that trade, not all of it, but most of it came across the Atlantic. And the Royal Navy played the major part in the Battle of the Atlantic. The second major navy in it was the Royal Canadian Navy. And the thumbnail for this stream is actually the last surviving Flower-class corvette, which is Her Majesty's Canadian ship Sackville, which resides in Halifax, Nova Scotia, which is the same sort of ship that the guys are supposed to be on at the beginning of The Cruel Sea in Compass Rose. So anyway, the Royal Navy played the major part in the Battle of the Atlantic. The Royal Canadian Navy played the second major part, and only third behind all those guys was the United States Navy, which was, naturally enough, when it eventually joined the war at the end of 1941, concentrating most of its naval forces in the Pacific against the Japanese. Now, the Battle of the Atlantic included loads of different aspects. There were German surface raiders like the Graf Spee that was defeated by the Free British cruisers at the Battle of the River Plate off South America. There were breakout attempts by powerful German units like Bismarck and Prince Eugen, where HMS Hood was destroyed with the loss of over 1,400 officers and men. And then just 2 days later, the British battleships HMS King George V and HMS Rodney battered the Bismarck to pieces. So there were those surface actions. There were also disguised German merchant raiders who looked like merchant ships, but were actually very heavily armed And one of those ships, for example, killed the Australian cruiser HMAS Sydney, actually not that far off the Australian coast, by taking her by surprise, although the Sydney destroyed the German ship at the same time. So they didn't. The ship didn't do any more further damage, but Sydney was lost with all hands. So there was this going on, but of course, primarily the Battle of the Atlantic was a war against the German U-boats. Now, the British after World War One, where the U-boats also caused a lot of casualties against mostly unarmed merchant ships, had developed a thing called ASDIC, which these days we call by the American name sonar. So that ships, submarines under the water could actually be detected, and to some degree, you could get where their position was, so you could accurately drop depth, more or less accurately drop depth charges and so on them. The problem was that up until 1936, at least, the Royal Navy budgets were severely constrained. One of the reasons they were severely constrained was when Winston Churchill was Chancellor for the Liberal Party, before he changed parties again later on. He really didn't want to spend anything on the British Armed Forces. The British had a thing called the 10-year rule, which meant that there wouldn't be a major war for the next 10 years. And the trouble was that under people like Churchill, that rule got extended year on year. So, like, if there was not going to be a major war in 1925 up until 1935, in 1926 it became 1936, and in 1927 it became 1937, which is an obviously ridiculous way to run your armed forces. But Churchill supported that while he was Chancellor of the Exchequer. Not so much when he was a like powerless backbencher in the 1930s, but that was a different story. But anyway, so the Royal Navy was still the largest navy in the world. We joined a thing called the Washington Naval Treaty in 1922, and under that treaty, the British abandoned the Anglo-Japanese Naval Alliance, which had run from 1902 very successfully until 1922. But of course, needless to say, although the Americans insisted on the British abandoning that alliance, they certainly didn't give the British any sort of alliance with them, because they still regarded the British Empire as a major rival. The 1922 Washington Treaty stopped a naval race between mostly Britain and America. Britain could just about have afforded to do that race in 1922, and the Americans could have also, but neither side really wanted to. I don't know. Looking back on it, I'm not sure. Did it avoid an Anglo-American war in the 1920s? Well, maybe. I'm not sure about that, to be honest. It certainly caused the Brits lots of problems. And then in 1930, there was the London Naval Treaty, which was really just an extension of the Washington Naval Treaty that added a few more rules, etc. The Brits signed again, and as a result, the British were the only guys who were building new battleships just before World War II that had 14-inch guns rather than 16-inch guns like everybody else. Because the Brits stuck to the treaty, whereas basically nobody else really did, to be honest. Not even the Americans, and certainly not the Germans or Japanese or Italians. Then you had idiots like Anthony Eden, the guy who did the Suez thing in 1956, when he was the part of the British Foreign Office, deliberately, because he was a twat, as far as I am concerned, made Italy an enemy of Britain over Ethiopia or Abyssinia, which was of no great concern to Britain. In fact, generally speaking, if Italy had taken over Abyssinia, probably would have been to the benefit of most Abyssinians, in all honesty. I mean, you're not allowed to say that sort of thing these days, but I think it's probably true. But somehow or another, no, actually, let's make Mussolini and the Italians enemies of the Brits too, so that in 1939, the Royal Navy was facing its nightmare scenario of not a war against one other power, which he could plan for. Like Britain had planned for a war against Japan from like 1923 or 24 onwards. Britain could easily do a war against Germany and could easily do a war against Italy. But the idea of like you've got to fight a war against Germany in the North Sea and the Channel and the Atlantic, you've got to fight a war against Italy in the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, and then you've got to fight a war against Japan in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific, is kind of like the nightmare scenario for any navy in the world. And even for the British Royal Navy, it was the nightmare scenario. But yet British politicians managed to have that come about. Most of whom get a pass these days, of course, because social liberalism, not something I believe in. But anyway, yeah, there you go. That's the Battle of the Atlantic. Now, the Germans were using their U-boats, their submarines, to try and basically blow apart British convoys. And the Royal Navy had planned for this kind of war. Like I said, they developed ASDEC, which we now call sonar, to detect submarines underwater. They were increasingly fitting radar and what have you to their ships. They had plans to build large numbers of escort vessels, but they couldn't do it in peacetime because the government wouldn't give them the money. Like one of the things people totally don't get, I beg your pardon, if they're nat socks and such like, is that Britain didn't want to fight World War II. The sensible British conservative politicians knew that Britain couldn't win a short war and couldn't afford a long war. So they had no desire to fight World War II. They were absolutely pushed into it by Adolf and his twatty friends. But the Royal Navy did have plans to mass produce escorts, and the Flower class corvettes, which the ship encompass in the Cruel Sea and the thumbnail for this video are, they were based on whale catching ships from the late 1920s, early 1930s. They were very seaworthy, but they were also very small, and they would have rolled on wet grass, as sailors say. Like they were not at all stable. They weren't going to like roll over and kill the guys that way, but like they would constantly move because they weren't very large ships. And like, as I say, the expression that seafaring guys use is she'd roll on wet grass, which means like, any sort of sea, and she would start moving all over the place, which makes doing everything on a ship more difficult. Like it gets tiring quite quickly when your ship's moving all over the place and you have to hang on everywhere you're going. And it particularly makes things like cooking and eating very difficult. But they were seaworthy vessels. They built loads and loads of them. Lots of them served in the Royal Navy. Lots of them served in the Royal Canadian Navy, and quite a lot also served in the Australian and South African navies in the war as well. But they were quite good at what they did. They weren't particularly fast. They weren't particularly heavily armed, but they did have a lot of depth charges and this kind of stuff. And increasingly, as the war went on, they got better anti-aircraft defense as well. The Brits also started building more and more escort destroyers, things like the Hunts, etc. And by about 1943, with various tactical innovations, the Royal Navy began, with the help of the Royal Canadian Navy and the United States Navy, had begun to defeat the German U-boats. We'd broken a lot of their codes, for example, so we sometimes knew where they were. And the Royal Navy had formed things like hunting groups that could go and reinforce a convoy that was being heavily attacked. And the great thing about convoy was, and the reason they used it, is that because the ocean is so enormous, like a group of 50 or even 100 ships is almost as difficult to find as one ship. And you can escort that 50 or 100 ships in that convoy. And when the enemy comes to attack you, that means it gives you the opportunity to attack them. So it's kind of like you're defending, but you're not really. because you know the enemy's got to come to you and attack you. And that's kind of what the Battle of the Atlantic was. Loads and loads of merchant seamen were killed. Large numbers of Royal Navy and Royal Canadian Navy, etc. seamen were also killed, but not half as many as U-boat guys by the end. By the end, your chances of surviving as a U-boat guy was very small indeed. Like there's a really excellent movie called The Boat, or Das Boot in German, I beg your pardon, which is an excellent movie, really, really great. But I have to say, I spent half of it hoping they were going to get sunk because they were trying to sink and kill British guys. So my kind of in-group bias was coming out there for sure. So yeah, so let's go on to the movie a little bit. So anyway, like I said, by 1943, the British started winning. By 1944, joining the German U-boat arm was pretty much suicidal. Even though the Germans were developing more and more advanced U-boats, they didn't have all that many of them. And most of them didn't really become operational. And as I say, by 1944, being a member of the German U-boat arm was really like it was a slightly slower way of committing suicide. Not a good plan at all. The Royal Navy, Royal Canadian Navy, and their other allies had really got on top of them. So let's have a look at the movie. Like I said, I don't want to make this a long stream. I think The Cruel Sea is probably the best British film about the Royal Navy in World War II. Jack Hawkins is splendid as Ericsson, who is the Royal Navy Reserve captain of the ship. It's easily the best role for Sinden and the other chap who's in it. They never did anything that was anywhere near as good as that afterwards. The other thing I like about the film is they do show some of the senior NCOs on the ship and what was going on with them. Like, they'd go home and find their relatives' homes had been bombed to crap by the Luftwaffe, and people had been killed and this kind of thing. And they do show that in the movie. They do show one of the officers' wives being a complete whore, basically. And that was not totally uncommon in World War II. Like my father was 12 at the end of World War II. And he told me from listening to conversations between his mother and his father, like my grandfather and grandmother, that sort of thing was not all that totally uncommon in World War II. In fact, Britain had a very high murder rate in 1946 as soldiers and sailors and airmen came home from overseas postings where they had sometimes been for 2 or 3 years and found their missus had been unfaithful to them and killed them. So, and this is a fact, you can go and look it up. The British murder rate did go up in 46 and 47 for precisely that reason. But, women left on their own for 2 or 3 years, what do you think they're going to do? They're not nuns. Most of them, that's not to say they weren't good ones. Of course there were, but not all of them. So yeah, anyway, this officer in the Cruel Sea, his wife is a complete bitch and is just basically having the time of her life while he's fighting for his country. Who would have thought that a woman would ever do something like that? It's almost as if the French women didn't cooperate with the Germans when the French surrendered. I mean, who would think they would do things like that? But yeah, so it's a very good movie. It's pretty accurate. They start off in this Flower class Corvette, and then eventually I think they get a Castle class frigate. And the great thing about it is, like, it's one of those old stiff upper lip British war movies, which are actually based on what the British character used to be. Like, Britons never used to exaggerate. They weren't very loud. They were extremely brave, but they didn't make a fuss about it. And like in that movie, I think the guys sink 2 U-boats in the whole film. Like if that was an American film, they'd have probably sunk 3 U-boats like on the first day and another 2 on the next day, including engaging one in a gunfight alongside. Sorry, yes, I am taking the piss out of that recent American film Greyhound, which was appalling shit. But anyway, yeah. So it's a very good British film. I do recommend it. People should go and see it. Now, it's based on a novel by Nicholas Montserrat, and Nicholas Montserrat, interestingly enough, was a fairly socialist journalist before World War II, and he did indeed join the Royal Navy, and he was an officer on escort warships in the Battle of the Atlantic, and he wrote a couple of other books. There's one that I like, which is about a veteran of the First World War, a working class British veteran of the First World War, who joins the heavy rescue units in London during the Blitz. And his job is to try and rescue people from like bombed out buildings in London during the Second World War. Hello, Frithwolf. Afternoon to you. Morning from me, but afternoon to you. That's an excellent book. But if you read Nicholas Montserrat's books, like I say, he was a pretty left-wing journalist. He was largely a kind of socialist sort of guy for the most part. And another interesting thing is that in the book, the crappy first lieutenant at the beginning of the movie, the idiot who nobody likes, who likes his snorkers, sausages, and all the rest of it, is actually Australian in the book. Although, to be fair, later on in the book, the same British ship gets a good Australian officer. So they do make up for that. But in the film, they made him they made Stanley Baker's character. They made a British guy. But in the book, he's actually supposed to be Australian. Although, as I say, later on, they get a really good Australian officer. So, like, the guy wasn't being anti-Australian. It was just, whatever. The book's well worth reading. I actually think the book's slightly better than the film on the whole. But it's well worth reading, and the book is the film is at least 95% faithful to the novel. And as I say, Montserrat did serve on escort warships in the Battle of the Atlantic, which is why it's pretty accurate. I think that's well worth watching. I'm going to give guys a recommendation. Please go and watch a video or a live stream that some Northern nationalist did earlier today, which is called White Privilege. It's well worth going to watch. It's a very good stream. And my next video is liable to be a not particularly long, but a hopefully interesting stream about Alexander Boris de Pfiffle Johnson, who is the British Prime Minister, and who is known to his friends and intimates as Alex or Alexander, and certainly not Boris. And it's going to look at Boris's parents as well. His mother was a very liberal artist, and his father worked for the World Bank, and then later on worked for the European Commission. So maybe, perhaps, if we look at that, we can see why Alexander Boris de Pfiffle Johnson may not be quite as nationalistic and British as he would like people to believe. But anyway, I think that's probably going to be my next little stream. I think I've probably said all I wanted to say about this, and I am going to finish because my son is serving in the Royal Navy, and the Royal Navy is the most important, the senior, and the best of all the British services, and I'm going to finish on this. Okay, ladies and gents, I think that's going to do me for now. And remember, always, rule Britannia.